1942. Nazi Germany began the production of a weapon that existed 50 years ahead of its time. It was an engineering masterpiece. Today, a single unit costs more than a modern luxury sports car. At private auctions, collectors pay $300,000 for one rifle. But the timing was wrong. 7,000 men. That was the number of elite Luftwaffe paratroopers who jumped over the island of Crete on May 20th, 1941. They were the pride of the German Reich. The sky turned black with parachutes. It was supposed to be another fast victory for the Blitzkrieg. But by sunset, the mission turned into a massacre. Why did the elite fail? They were highly trained and motivated, but engineering and logistics betrayed them. 3,500 men were dead or wounded within hours. The problem was the RZ-1 parachute harness. This design forced a paratrooper to land on his hands and knees. He had to perform a forward roll to survive the impact. Because of this violent landing, the men could not carry heavy gear. Each paratrooper jumped with only a pistol, 4 grenades, and a combat knife. Their primary weapons were not on their bodies. Rifles, machine guns, and crates of ammunition dropped separately in heavy metal containers. Strong winds blew. Wrong. The containers scattered across the rocky terrain. Many crates landed directly inside British and New Zealander defensive lines. The defenders didn't just hold their ground. They opened the German crates and used German machine guns to shoot the paratroopers still drifting in the air. Events accelerated. Those who hit the ground alive were trapped in their harnesses. Local Cretan peasants joined the fight. They used wooden hoes and old hunting rifles to kill the paratroopers tangled in silk cords. The scene was chaotic. In the headquarters of the 23rd Battalion, New Zealand officers didn't even stand up. The footage from the era would show a grim reality, officers firing pistols at descending targets from their desks. There was no mistake. The slaughter was absolute. The 3rd Battalion of the 1st Assault Regiment sent 120 men into the drop zone. Only 8 survived the first day. 112 men were wiped out before they could find a rifle. This was a story of brilliant engineering crushed by the simple arithmetic of war. It was a lesson in how to build a perfect weapon that no one could afford to use. The cost of the victory was too high. The elite of the Reich were beaten by peasants with farm tools. The drop ended here. 24 hours of combat. That was all it took to dismantle the elite. One battalion at Malem started the morning with 600 fighters. By nightfall, 400 of them were gone. The island of Crete became the largest airborne operation in human history. The Germans seized the territory, but the price was catastrophic. Out of 22,000 paratroopers, 6,500 were dead, wounded, or missing. More than half of these losses happened during the initial drop. It was a victory that destroyed the victors. How did the leadership react to such a slaughter? They celebrated. In July 1941, General Kurt Student arrived at the Wolf's Lair. This was Hitler's headquarters, hidden in the dense forests of East Prussia. The footage from this period shows a specific atmosphere: heavy concrete walls, dim electric lighting. The air smelled of damp earth and machine oil. Hitler pinned the Knight's Cross to Student's uniform. He invited the general for coffee. This was a rare honor. But the conversation was not a celebration. It was a funeral for a tactic. After the coffee, the Führer delivered his verdict. He declared that the era of the paratrooper was over. The reason was simple. The element of surprise was gone. The enemy now knew how to trap soldiers in the sky. Hitler's command was absolute. From that day forward, paratroopers would fight only as regular infantry. No more mass drops, no more vertical envelopment. Events shifted rapidly. Student, the man who built the German airborne from nothing, listened in silence. He did not argue. No one argued with the Führer in 1941, but there was no mistake about the tension in the room. Reich Marshal Hermann Göring watched from the sidelines. He disagreed with the decision. His Green Devils were his personal pride and his political leverage. He refused to let them fade into the mud of the infantry. Göring made a different plan. If his men were forbidden from jumping, they would at least outgun everyone else on the ground. They needed a weapon worthy of their elite status. Thus began a new race for firepower. December 1941. The Luftwaffe approached the Army Weapons Administration with a technical assignment for a revolutionary new rifle. The response was brief. Army officials dismissed the project as frivolous and technically impossible. They refused to participate. The Army command pushed forward with their own plan. They focused on an intermediate cartridge, a compact weapon, and massive production scales. This path eventually led to the Sturmgewehr 44 assault rifle. Why did the Luftwaffe demand a full-size cartridge in a lightweight gun? At first glance, a logical request, but in reality, a physical impossibility. Hermann Göring held a trump card. He owned the Rheinmetall-Borsig concern. He could give orders directly to his own factories and bypass the entire army bureaucracy. In essence, he was selling weapons to himself for a massive profit. He ignored the experts. December 14, 1941. The LC6 specification was sent to 6 different manufacturers. The document contained a list of impossibilities. The requirements were specific. The total length could not exceed 1 meter, matching a standard carbine. The weight had to stay under 4 kilograms. The accuracy had to be sufficient for sniper operations. There was more. The rate of fire had to match the MG-34 machine gun. The weapon required a lug for a bayonet and the ability to fire heavy rifle grenades. Finally, it had to use the full-size 7.92 by 57 millimeter cartridge. This was the same high-power round used in heavy machine guns. It was a total contradiction. It was like demanding a vehicle with the speed of a race car, the fuel economy of a moped, and the cargo capacity of a heavy van. The list of requirements looked like a mockery of the laws of physics. Engineers stared at the blueprints in disbelief. But one man took the assignment as a challenge. Of the 6 manufacturers contacted, only one produced a functioning prototype. The footage shows a strange side-loading weapon. This was the first working model of the FG-42. Events accelerated. The sound of the first test shots proved the concept worked. It was the birth of a legend. Thus began the development of the paratrooper rifle. Louis Stange from Rheinmetall-Borsig was the creator. He was an engineer who had already achieved the impossible once before. Stange grew up in Sommerda. This was a small town in Thuringia. At 19 years old, he joined the Dries Arms factory. There, he found a mentor. His teacher was Louis Schmeisser. Schmeisser was the man who developed the MP-18. This was the first practical submachine gun in history. In this environment, Stange learned the mechanics of automation. He understood how to make a weapon work reliably under pressure. During the 1930s, he designed the MG-34. It was the first universal machine gun in the world. Soldiers used it on a bipod, on a heavy mount, or inside armored vehicle turrets. Now, he faced an even more difficult task. The requirements were extreme. How did he solve the problem? Stange looked where others did not. He analyzed the gas system from a Lewis machine gun. This was a weapon from the First World War. He took that old mechanism and reimagined it for a completely new concept. The blueprint featured specific mechanical choices: a long gas piston stroke, a rotating bolt with 2 locking lugs, a spiral return spring. These were proven mechanics inside a frame that looked like it belonged in the future. The footage shows the most critical innovation: the straight line layout. The barrel, the bolt group, and the stock sit on a single horizontal axis. The design changed physics. Instead of the barrel climbing upward during fire, the recoil traveled straight into the shooter's shoulder. Today, this is the standard for every modern rifle. One single shot. That was the priority for the first trigger pull. In semi-automatic mode, the bolt remained closed to ensure maximum accuracy. In full automatic mode, the mechanism switched. The bolt operated from an open position. This allowed air to circulate and cooled the barrel between bursts. No other rifle in history used this dual system logic before or since. It was a mechanical anomaly. An engine that runs on both gasoline and diesel, switching instantly while in motion. The magazine sat on the left side. It was inserted horizontally. At first glance, the design looked awkward. In reality, it was a tactical calculation. A horizontal magazine allowed the shooter to press their body lower into the dirt. They could lie flatter than with any other weapon in the German arsenal. For a paratrooper dropping under fire, every centimeter of profile meant the difference between a hit and a miss. 1942. Midsummer. The prototype arrived at the Tarnowitz Proving Ground. Ballistics experts watched the results. The impossible weapon had become a reality. The German High Command issued the official index, FG-42. The masterpiece was ready for the front. But a new question emerged. Could the Third Reich actually afford to build it? Perfection carried a massive cost. The final bill was prohibitive. Louis Stange's original blueprints demanded chrome-nickel steel. This was a strategic alloy reserved for tank plating and Messerschmitt engines. By 1943, the Reich was running out of resources. Every kilogram of this metal was worth its weight in gold. The factory at Rheinmetall could not handle the complexity. They were already overwhelmed with standard infantry orders. Production shifted to the gunsmiths at Krieghof in the town of Suhl. The contrast was sharp. Before the war, Krieghof manufactured high-end hunting rifles for the European aristocracy. The craftsmen worked with the precision of jewelers. The footage from the era shows the problem. Hand-fitted parts, polished surfaces, fine tolerances. These men knew how to build a work of art. They did not know how to manufacture a mass-produced weapon quickly or cheaply. The project slowed to a crawl. Events accelerated. The war did not wait for luxury. A milled receiver, dozens of precision parts, tight tolerances, and manual hand-fitting. These were the hallmarks of the FG-42. One rifle cost the German treasury several times more than the STG-44 assault rifle. Production was not a flow, but a struggle. Why was the price so high? It was a matter of design over efficiency. But the real cost was measured in materials and sabotage. Two branches of the Reich's armed forces were waging a private war. This conflict had nothing to do with the front lines. The army controlled the distribution of all raw materials. The Luftwaffe depended entirely on these supplies. Every ton of alloy steel diverted to Hermann Göring's project was a ton stolen from army programs. Army generals refused to help their rivals. They pushed their own STG-44. That weapon was different. It could be stamped out by any factory with basic press equipment. The contrast was sharp. In Stalingrad, German soldiers were dying in the ruins. In Berlin offices, officials were dividing resources and sabotaging projects. It was a war of signatures and stamps. The rifle carried a fundamental flaw in its concept. The Luftwaffe demanded a full-size rifle cartridge. They wanted maximum range and penetrating power. This decision had consequences. The powerful cartridge turned the lightweight rifle into a beast. During automatic fire, the weapon became nearly impossible to control. 20 rounds disappeared from the magazine in seconds. The metal bipods often bent under the violent recoil. The camera shows the result. A barrel climbing toward the sky during a burst. Army experts identified these issues immediately. They knew an intermediate cartridge was the correct choice for a handheld weapon. But to admit this was impossible. It meant admitting their competitors were right. Pride dictated the design. By the end of 1943, the first batch of 2,000 rifles was finished. Then the supply chain collapsed. Manganese steel had already replaced scarce chrome-nickel steel. Now, even the manganese ran out. Factory floors went silent. Production was in agony. But the rifles already built were moving toward the front. A specific date approached, September 12, 1943. A test in the field was coming. Thus began the final chapter of the project. September 12, 1893. 10 DFS, 230 gliders detached from their tow planes over the Apennine Mountains. Inside these wooden frames sat 90 men. Their objective, Benito Mussolini. The deposed Italian dictator was a prisoner in the Campo Imperatore Hotel. The building sat at the peak of the Gran Sasso Massif, 2,000 meters above sea level. It was a natural fortress. Only one cable car led to the top. 200 armed carabinieri guarded the perimeter. The plan belonged to Major Harold Moores. He spent weeks calculating the risks. His paratroopers carried a secret. They were armed with experimental rifles featuring side-mounted magazines. These weapons had never seen a real battlefield. The gliders descended rapidly. They hit a rocky plateau just 100 meters from the hotel entrance. The impact sent stones flying. Dust clouds covered the landing zone. The Italian guards watched the silent gray silhouettes emerge from the wreckage. They saw the strange rifles. They saw the German uniforms. No one moved. No one reached for a trigger. The Carabinieri stood frozen as the paratroopers stormed the lobby. Mussolini was located and secured in under 4 minutes. Not a single shot was fired during the entire extraction. The operation was a clinical success. But Harold Moores did not get the credit. Instead, the cameras focused on Otto Skorzeny. He was an SS officer who joined the raid with 16 of his own men. Skorzeny was 6 feet tall, a deep saber scar. January 1944. German paratroopers held the defense at Monte Cassino. The target was an ancient Benedictine monastery sitting on a steep cliff. It overlooked the Liri Valley. Below the cliff sat the only road leading to Rome. Whoever controlled the monastery controlled the route to the Italian capital. This was the bottleneck of the entire campaign. 4 Allied assaults crashed against the stone walls of Cassino. 4 waves of infantry, tanks, artillery, and aircraft hammered the position. High explosive shells turned the monastery into a lunar landscape of gray rubble and deep craters. But the Germans did not move. They held their ground in the ruins. In these stone corridors, the FG-42 showed its true power. The battle was a nightmare of close quarters and dust. The echo of gunfire rang in the ears. White dust from pulverized stone filled the eyes of the shooters. The paratroopers fired precise single shots when an enemy appeared in a breach. They switched to short bursts when an Allied soldier jumped from around a corner. They changed modes instantly. There were no unnecessary movements. At first glance, a defeat, but in reality, a tactical stalemate. The paratroopers were nicknamed the Green Devils by the Allies. They retreated only when they received direct orders from the high command. It wasn't because they lost the fight for the monastery. It was because the front lines collapsed elsewhere. The defense had to be abandoned to avoid encirclement. Events accelerated. June 1944. The 2nd Parachute Division met the Americans in Normandy. They fought in the thick hedgerows of the Bocage. They defended the city of Saint-Lô. Finally, they retreated to the fortress of Brest. This campaign saw the largest concentration of FG-42s in the entire war. The footage shows American soldiers examining captured rifles. They could not believe their eyes. Intelligence officers handled the weapons with confusion. They had never seen a rifle with this much firepower in such a compact frame. It was a technical shock to the Allied command. 7,000 units. That was the total production number for the FG-42. The weapon was rare. But in the hands of the Green Devils, it was enough. The story of the rifle ended in the ruins of the European theater. 7,000 units. That was the total production for the entire duration of the war. To understand the scale of this failure, look at the other side of the factory floor. The German industry produced 14 million Mauser carbines. They manufactured 400,000 STG-44 assault rifles. The Americans built 5 million M1 Garands. The Soviets pushed 6 million PPSH submachine guns off the assembly lines. 7,000 units for every front and every year of the conflict. This was not standard equipment for an army. It was a drop in the ocean. Statistically, the weapon barely existed. Resource shortages strangled the project at every stage. The factories stopped receiving chrome-nickel steel. Then, the supply of manganese steel vanished. Eventually, even ordinary sheet steel became a luxury. Engineers had to rewrite the blueprints for every new batch. They made constant design changes just to use whatever scrap metal remained in the warehouse. The Army's STG-44 took priority for every shipment of raw materials. The Luftwaffe received only the leftovers from the Reich's industrial table. In early 1944, the experts delivered a final verdict. The FG-42 could not replace the submachine gun. It could not serve as a primary support weapon. What did the testing show? At ranges up to 400 meters, the FG-42 offered no advantage over the cheaper STG-44. It was redundant. At the same time, the manufacturing costs were astronomical. It required specialized materials that the German war machine no longer possessed. The recommendation was clear. Stop the production lines immediately. Focus all remaining resources on the assault rifle. But a deeper irony existed behind these logistical failures. Why did the project continue despite the evidence? High-ranking officials ignored the data. It was a matter of pride, not physics. The footage shows the reality of the front lines. Soldiers are seen carrying heavy Mausers, while the elite FG-42 remains a rare sight in the mud. The sound of high-speed fire was a luxury few units ever heard. The weapon became a ghost on the battlefield. There was no turning back. The Reich was burning through its final reserves. The decision to keep the FG-42 in production was not a military strategy. It was a refusal to admit defeat. The factories eventually fell silent. The story ended in the ruins of the production halls. 1941. After the bloodbath on Crete, German paratroopers stopped jumping. Hitler personally buried the concept of large-scale airborne assaults. The paratroopers became elite infantry, fighting in the mud and trenches. They no longer needed a specialized compact rifle for aircraft exits. They needed mass-produced, simple and reliable tools for ground combat. The FG-42 was a weapon for a war that no longer existed. It was designed for tactics from a bygone era. Luftwaffe generals continued to dream of airborne glory, but the reality was different. 7,000 rifles were manufactured. Most of them vanished in the chaos of the German retreat. They were lost in burning warehouses or buried under rubble, but several dozen copies survived. They didn't end up in a museum. Instead, they were shipped across the Atlantic. What happened next? It would change the history of firearms forever. The war in Europe ended, but the FG-42 was just starting its second life. In the autumn of 1944, captured samples arrived at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. American engineers began the teardown. They stripped the rifles to the last screw. They also studied the STG-44, the famous German assault rifle. At first glance, the STG-44 was the future, but in reality, the Americans were unimpressed. They officially labeled the STG-44 a mediocre 1946. American engineers took a captured German FG-42 and placed it on a workbench. They didn't just study it, they cut the weapon in half with a blowtorch. They took the belt-feeding mechanism from a German MG-42 and welded it directly onto the receiver. The result was a mechanical hybrid. It was a Frankenstein's monster stitched together from two different enemy systems. It looked crude. Metal slag covered the seams, but it worked. This was the first prototype of the T-52. 10 years later, this design would evolve into the M60 machine gun. Why did the Americans copy their enemies? The answer was simple. German engineering was light years ahead. The M60 became a legend. It was the pig, the workhorse of the Vietnam War, the weapon seen in 1,000 Hollywood movies. But this American icon carries the DNA of a rifle built for men who were forbidden to use parachutes. The gas system with its rotating bolt came from the Germans. The straight-line stock layout came from the Germans. Even the silhouette was unmistakable. American soldiers in the Mekong Delta carried a weapon born from the dreams of Nazi paratroopers. The footage shows the M60 spitting brass in the mud. Beneath the heat shield, the ghost of the FG-42 remained. But these weapons are now ghosts themselves. Fewer than 100 original FG-42 rifles exist on the entire planet. Only about 50 are registered for private sale in the United States. At auctions, the price tags are staggering. Collectors pay between $250,000 and $350,000 per rifle. These pieces of steel cost more than a luxury sports car. They cost more than a 3-bedroom apartment in a major city. What happened to Louis Stanch? He was the man who designed this masterpiece. He was the mind behind the complexity. The war ended. The Allied tribunal did not care about his genius. They put him on trial. The judge delivered a sentence of 2.5 years in a prison cell. Events took a strange turn after his release. Stanch did not return to an engineering firm. He moved to the small town of Hasleben. He signed a lease on a small building. He opened a grocery store. The engineer who created the most sophisticated automatic weapon of the 20th century spent his days weighing flour. He stocked shelves with canned goods and sold bags of spices to neighbors. He died in 1971. He was a quiet shopkeeper with a secret past. The story ended behind a grocery counter. Louis Stange is a name almost forgotten by history. Today, his rifles are worth a fortune at auctions. Collectors pay over $100,000 for a single unit, but Stange himself received nothing for his work. He died in obscurity. Why did such a masterpiece fail? It seemed like a technical triumph, but war is not a competition between engineers. It is a competition between economies, logistics, and political decisions. The FG-42 was flawless. It was a rifle that could do everything. It was a light machine gun, a sniper rifle, and an infantry carbine all in one. It anticipated the future of small arms by 40 years. It deserved its place in museums. But in 1944, the battlefield followed a different logic. A flawless weapon in the hands of 7,000 soldiers loses to a good gun in the hands of 1 million. The German paratroopers were elite. Their equipment was surgical, but the numbers did not add up. The footage shows the reality of the German factories. Machined steel, hand-fitted parts, intricate wooden stocks. It took hundreds of man-hours to build just one rifle. Rolexes do not win wars. Wars are won by Casio. They are won by those who can stamp out weapons quickly, cheaply, and in massive quantities. While Germany polished one FG-42, the Soviet Union and America manufactured 1,000 basic rifles. The production lines never stopped. There was no turning back. The Germans created a masterpiece. That is precisely why they lost. Precision became a trap. Quality became a bottleneck. In the end, the most advanced rifle of World War II was nothing more than a footnote in a losing campaign. The archives show the final count. Only 7,000 units were ever produced. The war ended in the ruins of Berlin.